Hey, glad to be with you. This is Braden, and we are in day 4 of 21 for 21, where we're taking each day throughout these weeks just to take a part of our day to pause and reflect on God's character. And today we're going to be looking at a part of the Bible maybe you haven't even heard of in your life. Maybe this is the first time you're ever going to look at this verse. And it's from the book of Habakkuk. You're like, there's a book named Habakkuk. I know, it's a funny name. Habakkuk is one of the shortest books in the Bible, and it's kind of tucked away at the end of the Old Testament. Habakkuk was one of the prophets of Israel that came kind of later on in the history of Israel. And when Habakkuk wrote this book, things in Israel's time and day had looked pretty dark and bleak and chaotic. And Israel has this history of God doing these incredible miracles in their people and their history. But at this point in time, they almost wondered if that was even possible again, if God even could intervene in their world anymore, or if he had kind of just gone away and he had kind of given up on them. And so Habakkuk writes this book kind of outlining, the situation in their day. But then there's this one verse in Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 2. It's a one verse prayer that Habakkuk prays. It's basically saying, God, we've heard these stories of the way that you've worked in the past. Could you possibly do them again in our day? So if you join me, we're going to look at Habakkuk 3, verse 2, and we're just going to read these. But this is going to be our prayer, and our action step for the day is just to recite this prayer throughout the day. So this is what Habakkuk 3:2 says. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. See, Israel had this rich history of God calling them out and working in their people in miraculous and remarkable ways. There was these legendary stories of the way that God had rescued them and had worked in their lives. But things seemed kind of dark and chaotic at this point in time when Habakkuk's writing, saying, we've heard these stories. We stand in awe of the things that we've heard from our ancestors about what you've done in our world. God, could you possibly intervene again in our day? Could you work in our lives again the same way that you worked in the past? Could you do that again in our world? And maybe when you think about the world and what's going on around us, you feel like there's some similarity there. That maybe you look at what's going on in the world and it feels kind of dark and chaotic and out of control. And you've heard some of these stories in the past of how God has worked in people's lives and the history of the world. But you almost wonder if he's kind of left us alone or something. Could God possibly do any of these things in our day as well? Like maybe you've heard some of the great Old Testament stories. David and Goliath. It's a great story of God's intervention in the world. And you're like, that's such a cool story, and you love that story. You've heard about Noah and his ark, right? And the story that God rescued his people in that way. I like that one. It involves a big boat, right? But you wonder if maybe those kind of things are stories from the past, if they could even possibly be true again in our time. Or maybe you look more to Jesus' time and some of the stories about the way that Jesus did things in his day. You know how Jesus fed 5,000 people with just some bread and some fish. Could something like that actually happen again today? Or Jesus walking on water? Or Jesus bringing dead people back to life? Jesus healing people? You hear some of those stories like, that sounds incredible. I want Jesus to intervene in my life that way. But is it even possible? Or even kind of fast forward throughout history a little bit, and you just look at some of the ways that God has been active in our world through modern medicine and advances in technology and education and some of these things, and you see the way that our world has progressed. We see that God has been active throughout human history, that he's been intervening time and time again to rescue his people. We look at before the world was even created, God is a God that has been active in our world. He hasn't just kind of sat far away and watched things happen. God has been intervening, ultimately intervening in our world through Jesus and his people as we pursue this relationship with Jesus and kingdom advancement in our world. But maybe right now you sit here and say, God, I've heard some of these stories about the way you've intervened in the world. We stand in awe of what you've done in the past. Is there any way in our kind of dark and chaotic world that you could do these things again? And the answer is God is always intervening. He's always active in our world. And this is Habakkuk's prayer. God, would you repeat these things again in our day? These stories that can only be credited to you, can you do those again? Maybe there's some things going on in our world that you say, God, we need your intervention. Yeah, we're trying to push through this global pandemic. We need God's intervention in that. But there's so much more going on in the world than that. We think about globally and the way this is affecting things. But then maybe there's just personal ways. We also need God's intervention in our lives. And we can say, God, would you intervene in my life? I've heard of the ways that you've intervened in other people's lives. Maybe you've heard stories of friends or family that lives have been transformed as they've walked in this relationship with Jesus. You say, God, could you do something like that for me as well? And we can lift these things up in prayer. Just like Habakkuk said in Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 2. Lord, I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Saying, God, we've heard these stories of the way you've intervened in the past. Could you do that again now? And I think this is a great prayer to begin the year with. Saying, God, there are so many things going on. Would you do these things again in our world, in my life? So I just want to invite you. We're going to just take a moment to pray together. But I want to invite you. Maybe there's something going on with your job. And you're saying, God, I need you to intervene because I'm not certain about what's going to happen with the future of my job. Maybe it has to do with your family situation or what's going on there. God, would you intervene in my family and do something that only you can take credit for? Maybe it's a health concern in your own life. Maybe it's something going on with family or friends that you want God to intervene on. And we say, God, we've heard of the great stories of your intervention in the world. We believe that you want to continue to be active in our lives and in our world. Would you do these things again in our day? And that's our prayer for today, just repeating Habakkuk's prayer. God, we've heard of the things you've done in the past. We stand in awe of those things. Would you do them again in our time, in our day, in our lives? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you to pray with me, and I'm just going to repeat these words from Habakkuk. And then there's going to be just a moment just of some quiet. And whatever's on your heart, lift them up to God. Say, God, would you intervene in this way in my life and in our world? And then we'll just be done together for the morning. And I'd encourage you throughout the day to repeat these words from Habakkuk. God, we've heard of what you've done. Would you do them again in our day and our time? Would you pray with me? God, we listen to these words of Habakkuk and we repeat them in our hearts. Or Habakkuk says, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. God, would you intervene in these specific ways in our lives and in our world right now as we lift them up just in the quietness of our own hearts before you. God, if we think about everything going on in the world, it's not hard to feel down about the chaos of our world, the uncertainty, the darkness. But we don't want to get wrapped up in that. Instead, we want to trust you, a God who continues to intervene and be active in our world. And we want to ask you to do the same things that we've heard about you doing in the past. Would you do them again now in our lives, in our world? And would you be the one that gets credit for those things, God? Throughout the day, we repeat this prayer, God. We've heard of the great things you've done. Would you do them again in our time? And we're so grateful that you are a God that has intervened in our world, that ultimately you intervened through the person and the work of Jesus. And we ask that you continue to repeat that again today and in this year to come. And we love you. Amen.